The lonely ranch. The wind bit at Sarah's exposed cheeks, turning them the color of frozen cranberries. Each gust wrestled the shovel from her gloved hands as she tried to clear a path to the cattle trough. The snow, relentless and unforgiving, had already buried the lower fence posts. The herd, usually boisterous, huddled together, their breath clouding the frigid air. They bawled their discontent, a mournful symphony that echoed across the desolate landscape, a sound that mirrored the ache in Sarah's own heart. Back inside the ranch house, the fire in the hearth offered little comfort against the penetrating cold that seeped from the log walls. Sarah stared at the photograph on the mantel. Thomas, grinning, his arms slung around her shoulders. The memory of his warmth was a cruel contrast to the emptiness that now permeated every room. She traced the outline of his face with a calloused finger, a silent conversation with a ghost. With a sigh that puffed a cloud in the chilly air, she retreated to the pantry. Flour dwindling. Beans almost gone. Salt pork enough for a few more meals. The coming months loomed like a blizzard on the horizon. She ran her hand over the rough-hewn shelves, a knot tightening in her stomach. This winter was proving to be crueler than any she remembered. A solitary life, she knew, demanded resilience. But tonight, surrounded by the silence of the lonely ranch, resilience felt a long way off. Whispers in the blizzard. The wind howled like a banshee, biting at Sarah's exposed skin even through her thick wool coat. Snow swirled in blinding white sheets, obscuring the familiar landmarks of her ranch. She urged her horse, Buck, onward, squinting against the onslaught. The blizzard had descended with savage speed, and she needed to check the north fence line before nightfall, before more of her cattle wandered off into the storm. A low whimper, almost swallowed by the wind, made Buck skittish. Sarah pulled back on the reins, scanning the frozen landscape. Then she saw them, huddled together in a shallow drift, almost invisible against the snow. A man, wrapped in tattered furs, shielding 3 small children. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide with fear. Comanche. Dread coiled in Sarah's stomach. Her late husband, Thomas, had always warned her about the dangers, about the raids. But looking at them, shivering and desperate, she saw only vulnerability. The children, no older than 5, were triplets, their thin limbs intertwined. The man, his face etched with exhaustion, looked near collapse. She knew the risks. Shelter meant food. Food meant dependence. Dependence. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the memory of Thomas, his fear, his prejudice. But the image of her own empty hearth flashed in her mind. So much food in her cellar. So much empty space in her house. Hello? Her voice was barely a whisper against the storm. Are you hurt? The man looked up, his dark eyes wary, but Sarah saw a flicker of hope ignite within them. A warm hearth. The broth simmered on the stove, its savory aroma chasing away the lingering scent of damp earth and fear. Sarah spooned it carefully into chipped enamel bowls, blowing gently before offering it to each child. One gulped it down with noisy enthusiasm, another dribbled half down his chin, while the third eyed Sarah with cautious curiosity before tentatively sipping. Already their distinct personalities were emerging. Kawa watched, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He said something softly in Comanche, and the hesitant triplet finally drained his bowl. Sarah felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since before. Later, the triplets, bellies full and clad in oversized shirts of Caleb's, explored the house. Their small hands trailed along the worn furniture, their bare feet padding softly on the wooden floors. One tried to climb the bookshelf, another investigated the intricacies of a wind-up clock, while the third simply stared, wide-eyed, at a framed photograph of Caleb. Sarah caught Kawa's eye as the clock chimed, startling the climbing triplet into a fit of giggles. He met her gaze, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. She found herself mirroring his expression, a hesitant upturn of her own lips, the first genuine smile she'd offered in what felt like an eternity. The sound of the triplets' laughter filled the room, chasing away the shadows that had haunted it for so long. Perhaps, just perhaps, warmth could truly take root here again. Helping hands. The sun beat down on the plains, baking the earth to a dusty crisp. Sarah watched, leaning against the porch railing, as Kawa approached the broken fence line. He moved with a quiet purpose, his lean muscles flexing beneath his worn shirt. He'd taken one look at the fallen posts and declared, with a surprising confidence, that he knew fences. Sarah had been skeptical, but Kawa worked with a focused intensity, his hands deft and sure. He straightened the warped posts, splicing them with seasoned wood he'd found stacked near the barn. He knew knots she hadn't seen in years, knots her grandfather used to tie. Within hours, a sturdy patch stood where splintered ruin had been. The next day, they rode together to check the cattle. The air hummed with the drone of insects and the distant lowing of the herd. Sarah showed him how to spot signs of illness, how to read the cattle's behavior. Kawa, in turn, pointed out subtle changes in the wind, the faint scent of rain carried on the breeze, things she, despite her years on the ranch, had grown accustomed to ignoring. He was a quick study, absorbing her lessons with a quiet intensity. When a calf strayed too close to a gully, Sarah demonstrated the subtle art of herding. Kawa watched, then mirrored her movements, his whoops and calls echoing across the open range. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before. She found herself smiling, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The work wasn't lighter, but it felt different, shared. A silent understanding bloomed between them, a fragile thing, but real. Whispers of prejudice. The air in Miller's general store hung thick with the smells of cured meat and simmering suspicion. Sarah McKinley's name, usually absent from their idle chatter, was now a constant murmur, like a hive of disturbed bees. Comanche, Mrs. Henderson hissed, weighing a handful of dried beans. Right here, practically in our laps. A woman alone. Jed Stone, leaning against a flour barrel, listened with a predatory gleam in his eye. Later that day, he convened a meeting with the town council in the dusty back room of the saloon. "Gentlemen," he drawled, his voice laced with false concern, "we can't ignore the threat. McKinley's place is isolated. If the Comanche are emboldened." He let the thought hang, heavy and unspoken, in the smoky air. He painted a picture of raiding parties and stolen livestock, subtly suggesting that Sarah's presence was a danger to them all. Sarah felt the shift the next time she rode into town. The usual nods were curt, the smiles strained. Children who once waved enthusiastically now clung to their mother's skirts, their eyes wide with fear. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket woven from prejudice and whispered lies. The warmth she'd begun to feel, the faint stirring of hope, threatened to be extinguished by the cold winds of suspicion. Jed Stone's words, she knew, were poison, and the town was drinking deep. Standing together. "They want us gone," Kawa Sarah said, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. They stood on the porch, the sprawling ranchland a stark contrast to the tightening knot of fear in her stomach. "Then we stay," Kawa replied, his voice a low rumble. "This land, it speaks to me. Reminds me of home." He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "You are strong, Sarah McKinley, but strength alone is not enough." He gestured for her to follow him to the training grounds he'd carved out near the stables. For hours, he guided her through basic Comanche defensive moves, his touch surprisingly gentle as he corrected her stance. The desert air filled with the thud of fists meeting padded targets, the rasp of their breath, and the silent determination that passed between them. The next day, a cloud of dust heralded the arrival of a wagon carrying Jed Stone and a mob of angry townsfolk. They stopped at the edge of the property, their faces contorted with hostility. "McKinley!" Stone bellowed, his voice carrying across the distance. "We're here to deliver a message. This land ain't for savages and their sympathizers." Sarah walked slowly to the gate, her hand resting on the rifle hidden beneath her shawl. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she met Stone's venomous stare. "This is my land," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And I decide who stays." The stampede. Dust devils danced on the horizon, a grotesque mockery of the chaos Jed Stone had unleashed. The earth trembled, a low growl building into a deafening roar. A brown wave, a tide of panicked cattle, surged towards Sarah's ranch. "They're coming right for the house," Kawa shouted, his voice barely audible above the din. He spurred his horse, racing towards the oncoming mass. Sarah, rifle abandoned, frantically tried to herd the few remaining horses into the barn. A monstrous longhorn, eyes wide with terror, broke from the pack, heading straight for her. She scrambled back, but the ground was uneven. Her boot caught, and she fell, the beast thundering past, its hooves a hair's breadth from her head. Pain exploded in her leg. The world spun. She tasted dust and blood. Dimly, she saw Kawa, a lone figure silhouetted against the stampede, weaving through the frantic animals with impossible grace. He reached her, scooped her up onto his horse, and turned back into the chaos, a whirlwind of muscle and courage against the brown tide. "Hold on, Sarah," he yelled, his voice strained. The horse bucked, fighting the current of terrified beasts. The air was thick with the stench of fear and manure, the ground vibrating with the force of 1,000 hooves. They had to get out now. A change of heart. The sun beat down on blistered hands, but for the first time since the stampede, Sarah felt a warmth that wasn't just the desert heat. Old Man Hemlock, who'd always spat tobacco juice in her direction, was hammering fence posts alongside young Thomas, his grandson, who'd avoided Kawa like the plague. Others followed. faces etched with a mixture of shame and determination, rebuilding what fear had broken. Sarah knelt beside Kawa, dabbing antiseptic on the gash on his forearm. The herd had trampled him, but he'd shielded the smallest of the triplets, shielding them from the worst. "You're reckless," she murmured, her voice thick. He winced, but his dark eyes held hers. "They are children, Sarah, like my own." She finished bandaging his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. The air crackled, thicker than dust. "Thank you, Kawa." He reached for her hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on her knuckles. "For what?" "For everything," she whispered. The scent of sage and sweat clung to him, intoxicating and familiar. A hawk cried overhead, and for a moment the hammering faded, the desert hushed. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough. "I." She leaned in, her breath catching. The moment stretched, suspended between fear and a longing so profound it resonated in her very bones. Then a shout from the barn broke the spell, pulling them back to the world of splintered wood and aching muscles. But something had irrevocably shifted, a silent promise hanging in the air between them, as tangible as the sweat on their brows. A future of unity. The murmurs rippled through the crowd like a dust devil as Sarah stepped onto the makeshift platform, Kawa's hand firm in hers. Fear coiled in her stomach, but seeing Kawa's steady gaze, she found her voice. "Some of you have whispered, judged," she said, her voice amplified by the town's old speaker system, "but I see only a good man, a strong father, and a future." She turned to Kawa, her eyes shining. "I love you," she declared, the words ringing with conviction. A collective gasp swept through the town. "And I love those boys. They are my family now." The wedding was a tapestry woven with threads of two cultures. Navajo chants mingled with the hymns Sarah remembered from childhood. Kawa, resplendent in traditional Comanche attire, met Sarah, radiant in a simple white dress adorned with turquoise, beneath an arch decorated with wildflowers and feathers. The scent of sage mingled with the sweet perfume of roses. They exchanged vows, promises whispered in Navajo and English, sealing their commitment not just to each other, but to a future built on understanding. Years later, the ranch was a haven. Laughter echoed across the fields as the triplets, now boisterous boys, played tag with a group of children as diverse as the wildflowers that dotted the landscape. Sarah watched, her arm around Kawa, the sun warm on her face. The judgment had faded, replaced by curiosity, then acceptance, and finally a hesitant embrace of the new normal. The ranch, once just Sarah's legacy, had become something more, a symbol of unity, a place where differences were celebrated and love knew no boundaries. The future, once uncertain, now bloomed with possibility.